rainbows and rain and these sorts of things, but now we have naturalistic explanations of these, and so we don't need God anymore. So much to say here, but I really don't think that could be further from the truth. When you start to look into it, actually, the two perhaps most significant scientific discoveries of the last century both point strongly to the existence of God. So first you have the fact that the universe has a beginning, that at one point it didn't exist and then at another point it did exist. What explains that change? And what would the cause of that change have to be like? Well, it would have to be outside of space and time because it would have created space and time. And to create all of this, it would have to be highly powerful, highly intelligent, highly creative. So we're led by that scientific fact to posit something which is highly intelligent, highly powerful, highly creative, and outside of space and time. And I find it hard to think of something better for that than God. And this is a new scientific discovery, but it's not a new claim within the Christian worldview. You go right back to the beginning of your Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then a second scientific fact, this one really just forming around a consensus in the last 35 or 40 years, the fine-tuning of the universe. Scientists have come to a consensus, not just Christians, scientists in general, that the fundamental parameters of the universe needed to be finely tuned on a razor's edge in order for life to be possible. Not just life as we know it, not just life on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. One Cambridge astronomer, he likens the chances of this happening just based on chance to a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just by chance producing a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. An Oxford physicist, he says that the percentage difference that you could have while still maintaining the possibility of life is 1 part in 10 to the power of 10, raised in turn again to the power of 123. If I were to try to write out that percentage for you, I couldn't. Because even if I turned all of the matter in the universe into paper, I still wouldn't have nearly enough paper to write the number of zeros that you would need. Now, interestingly, I saw an interview with Richard Dawkins, and he said that it's an interesting hypothesis whether or not we have been seeded here by other intelligent life forms somewhere else in the universe or in a different universe. And I found that incredible for him to say that. To think that actually, even Richard Dawkins can see the marks of design in the universe. It's not actually that he's against intelligent design, he just has a specific bias against divine design. And then just one final thought. The regularity of the universe. When we wake up tomorrow, we just assume that the universe is going to carry on in the regular, stable way that it always has. We never stop to ask why. Why is the strength of gravity going to be the same tomorrow that it is today? You might say to me, well, it's always been that way. But that's not an answer to the question. That's the question itself. Why has it always been that way? There are infinite number of ways it could be. And why are we so confident it will be that way tomorrow? I don't think that atheism has an answer to that question. But if you bring God into the equation, you do have an answer to that question. Because the universe is regulated by somebody who wants us to live meaningful and coherent lives that we can make sense of. And so this regularity in the universe, the actual thing that underlies the entire scientific enterprise, that's what allows us to perform scientific experiments, I think it only makes sense if God exists. So I've actually been led to believe not only that science doesn't disprove God, but actually that only God proves science.
It's interesting. Ravi, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I wanted to. And that's fantastic. And by the way, the book that we co-authored, Jesus Among Secular Gods, it's worth the price of that book for Vince's chapter on science. When he wrote that and I read it, I just deeply moved by it. It's a very important thing for you to come get your hands around, because that fallacious assumption that science has disproved God is nothing more than a tendentious use of one particular discipline. I was giving a lecture at Cornell, and a young student came up to me and she said, I don't understand what you all are talking about. She said, I live every waking moment as a scientist. I am a scientist. I live, drink, breathe science. You're asking us to move into metaphysics and philosophy. I don't understand that. I said, can I ask you a question? She said, yes. I said, have you ever worked in a lab? She said, I did. I said, what discipline of science gives you the imperative to give honest reports on your findings? I said, can you tell me what book in physics tells you that because of science you need to be honest? I said, you're already dealing with metaphysical realities. In fact, you're dealing with spiritual realities. The fact that you're called to be honest has very little to do with physics or chemistry or biology. You are using then value judgments and the philosophy and the notion of truth. I said, how would you ever like it if someday you find out that actually scientists had the cure for cancer, but they never ever decided to tell us because they wanted to continue to be scientists and not philosophers. So they never told us the truth. I said, how atrocious would that be? Here's the application I want to make, and I want you to hear me carefully. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., when he won the Nobel Prize, made one of the most powerful speeches you ever want to read. And he said this, I refuse to believe that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to believe that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. He ended that speech with these words, I believe unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. What an incredible statement. Now I ask you, unarmed truth and unconditional love does not come from science. In fact, science will give us more and more sophisticated instruments to ultimately be able to destroy. And it was a naturalist, Aldous Huxley, who said, we are living today not in the delicious intoxication of the early successes of science, but in the grisly morning after, where it has become quite apparent that what science may have actually done is to introduce us to improved means in order to obtain hitherto unimproved or deteriorated ends. In other words, science can give you the means. It is going to be your values and your philosophy of life that will give you the ends to which you can use it. And that can only come from God Himself. And look at our world today. Take a look at what's happening in our world today. What discipline of naturalism is going to help us solve the problems if you cannot change the heart of a human being? And for that only God is big enough to do it. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Science and the worldviews have to go hand in hand. And the supreme worldview is the worldview that God gives to you and to me.
Amazing. The book is called Jesus Among Secular Gods, and I know that you're going to want to get a hold of this because it will allow you to go much deeper into the questions that we're talking about today. One of the big questions that is surfacing, Lauren asked about a family member with cancer. How do I explain that God loves her, even though now she's going through cancer and she names how many times she's been through that battle. Alexander asks, how can a loving God allow evil in the world? This question of pain, suffering, and injustice in the world, how is that compatible with a God who is both powerful and loving?
I'm sorry, those of you who have asked questions, I'm sorry that you're going through that. I know this question is never an abstract and a philosophical one. In fact, the first time that I had a conversation about this question after I became a Christian was with my Aunt Regina, and she shared with me some serious suffering in her life, and I launched into my abstract philosophical responses, and she listened very graciously, and then she turned to me and she said, but Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother. Very fair response, and I've always tried to be slower in responding to this question since then. And I think we see that in Jesus as well, when his good friend Lazarus died, and he waited a couple of days before he went to see him, and he had already died. And Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, you can read between the lines, they didn't seem too impressed. Why didn't you come sooner? If you had been here, our brother would still be alive. And I think Jesus could have given an explanation. He could have defended himself in that moment, but he knew it was time to just weep with them. And we get the shortest verse in the Bible, that Jesus wept. Let me try to say something to that question of explanation, but with that as a backdrop, recognizing how personal of a question this is. I'll just briefly open up two approaches. There are many, but here are two of them, and Ravi might add another one as well. Sometimes when we think about this question, we picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering, and the ones that we love in this world with all of its suffering. And then we picture ourselves in a very different world with far less suffering or with no suffering. And then we think to ourselves, surely God should have made me and the ones I love in that world rather than in this world. Very reasonable thought. I think there's a mistake hidden within it. There was a point early in my parents' dating relationship. Second date, standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, my dad notices a ring on my mom's finger. So he asks about it. She says, oh, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice. My dad said, oh, yeah, it is nice. Let me see it. So she took it off and she handed it to my dad. My dad hurled it off the bridge. And he watched it sink to the bottom of the East River. He said, you're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore. And my mom loved it. I think that was the clinching moment for them. But what if it hadn't been? What if my mom had responded more normally and said, this guy's nuts, I better run off with the old boyfriend instead? What would that have meant for me? Now, I might be inclined to think I might have been better off. Maybe the other guy was taller, more athletic, better looking. Maybe he lived in a castle. That would have been great. I could have gotten to live in a castle. But that would be a wrong way to think about it. Because if my mom had wound up with the other guy and not with my dad, it's not me who would have come to exist. It's someone else. Maybe that child would have lived in a castle and enjoyed it, but it wouldn't have been me. Part of what makes me who I am, not everything, but part of what makes me who I am is my beginning. The parents I have, the sperm and egg I came from, the combination of genes that's true of me. Now, if all it took was changing who my mom wound up with to change my existence, what if God had made an extremely different world, the world that we imagine we wish he had made over here? Oftentimes we want to take, so understandably, we want to take some piece of serious suffering out of the world while keeping everything else the same. But I don't think it works that way. I think if we change something significantly, actually a lot changes. It might be the case that actually without knowing it, we wish ourselves and everyone that we love right out of existence. And I don't think that God likes that idea. Getting back to the question, why is it the case that God would choose you? Sometimes people say to me, well, he should have made that world anyway. Why me? And I think the one-word answer to that question is grace. Yes, God could have made beings who were more impressive than me, who maybe would have suffered less than me as well, and you, and the people we love. But I think he just found himself with love for us. I think he just looked down like a parent at a newborn child and just said, I see you, created in my image, and I love you, and I desire to bring you into existence and to call you into a relationship with myself. Even if that means living in a broken world initially, that's not the end I have for you ultimately. One final story, another approach. I was 6 years old now. I'm out on my neighbor's front lawn and I'm playing football. I'm getting knocked around pretty good by some older kids. I start crying. I go running home to my mom who's on the front porch and I'm yelling, I'm not tough enough, I'm not tough enough. So what does my mom do? She did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do. She positioned herself like this. She got down in quite an athletic stance. She hung her nose out in the air. She looked at me lovingly and she said, punch me in the nose. You are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. It's the beginning of my boxing career. And I looked at her like she was crazy, and she was. But I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but I did. I actually reared back. I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose, and to my astonishment and to her astonishment, blood actually began to come out of my mom's nose and trickle down her face. Then came the most memorable, gorgeous image from my childhood. Through this blood came the most dazzling, just radiant, joyful smile. And my mom said, now get back out there. And she sent me back out into that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. Now, you might not know what to make of that story. Understandably so. What a bizarre thing for my mom to do. What a messy, bloody, unthinkable thing to do. And yet I also think, in at least one sense, what an extravagant display of love. My mom brought me into this world, and she knew when she did that there would be serious suffering in my life, just as there is in every person's life at one point or another. That didn't make her evil. And here's the important question: why not? Because when my eyes filled with tears, she didn't run from that. She didn't stay far away, but she bent down into my suffering with me, even though that meant suffering at the hands of her own child. And that for me is a picture of Jesus on the cross, where God did something unthinkable and messy and bloody, where he did not stay far away, but he stepped down into our suffering with us, even though that meant suffering at the hands of those that he had created. And that's why I believe that I can trust him even in the face of suffering.
Amazing.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 1820, Roswell, Georgia 30077.
It's interesting if you look back in the history of ideas, the problem of evil wasn't really considered such till about the 17th, 18th century onwards. And of course it's been trawled out more and more by our new atheist friends these days, being the idea that if there's a God who is all good and is all holy and is all powerful, how could evil exist? Since if he was all good, he wouldn't allow it. If he was all knowing, he would know what's going to happen, he would stop it, and so forth. But I think when we look at it, this argument from evil is actually an argument that points us towards also the existence of God.
Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. And if it is a departure from the way things ought to be, that means there is a way things ought to be. There is a design plan for this universe. And the only way you can have a design plan that is good, that is supposed to be perfect, is if God exists. So the problem of evil really drives us right back to the existence of God. It does not drive us away from him when we think about it from a biblical perspective or even from a logical perspective.
If God truly has created this world in freedom, then there is always the possibility, if it's truly free, for freedom to be both used in good ways and in evil ways. So we can explain the human problem with evil because there are times when humans perpetrate evil against their own bodies, against one another. They use their freedom, misuse their freedom, really, in ways that bring about evil. I myself lost my husband and didn't in a million years see that coming. I would say that everybody who's gone through grief experiences the absence of God, from great, wonderful Christian people like C.S. Lewis to myself to others. I've read in lots of grief literature that there is that sense that God has abandoned you. So I would say I understand where you're coming from. But I would also say in my own process that as I continue to wrestle with God over it, to argue with God, to pour out my feelings before God, even feelings of, I don't like you anymore, God, I don't love you, how could you do this to me? There is a way in which God is very present in that dark experience, and that's the only way I can describe it. As I clung on, and as I